Okay, so today we're going to talk about the second chapter in your book, Avian Diversity and Classification. This chapter introduces uh, the diversity or thoughts about the diversity of avian life, and it hits on some topics that you may have some familiarity with already, things like Linnaean taxonomy, biogeography, um, and a little bit of evolution, though we will be talking about that part in the next chapter. It talks about things that probably if you've had some general biology courses in college, you have some familiarity with. But let's take a look at that. So in this class, we are studying the clade, which is a class in Linnaean taxonomy called aves. And in aves, that's all the birds. There are about 10,000 species of birds. Now, it's more like 11,000 species, but I mean, this is just a rough ballpark estimate. And it is thought that in reality, there's probably more like, you know, 15 or 20,000 species. Many species have not yet been described. So the true number of species, just like for any other taxonomic category, isn't known exactly. This is just about what we know right now is around 11,000. All of these species share a common ancestor. We'll talk more about what that means in a little bit, particularly when we get to the next chapter and we talk about evolution. So the diversity of life is studied by systematists, and that study is called systematics. And systematists are really interested in studying two different things: the classification of organisms and the phylogenetic or evolutionary relationships of organisms. So when I talk about the classification of organisms, what I'm talking about is naming organisms and assigning them to groups within a hierarchical framework. In that hierarchical framework, which we'll go through a refresher on here in a couple minutes, is the Linnaean taxonomy that you may have learned in general biology. Phylogenetics is a way to study the evolutionary relationships of organisms using a phylogeny. And you can think of a phylogeny like a tree of life. It's a diagrammatic representation of the relationships, the closeness of the evolutionary relationships of different groups of organisms, in this case of birds. Um, and we're going to look at some different phylogenies, at least a little bit, when we talk about avian evolution in the next chapter. But just for now, understand that these are the two things that systematists are very interested in studying. And when they make these phylogenies, two of the more important things that go into creating these are the morphology of the organisms that they're studying and the genetic information of those organisms. So you might ask, where does the data for building these phylogenies come from? Obviously, there's the act of actively going out and collecting that data in the field, and certainly that happens. But much of the data that we have is historical data going back sometimes a couple hundred years. And that data comes from museums. So when you look at this picture, you know probably you think, well, that's sad. There's a bunch of dead birds in drawers, and the way those birds got there is, realistically, historically, they were harvested, often via shotgun. That was one of the ways that they would have been harvested historically. Um, and and so, today that's much, much, much less common, at least for these sorts of purposes. But the historical data that we have in these museums is extremely important. Because we have that, we can do all sorts of studies on the evolutionary relationships of these organisms, and it is incredibly valuable. in that respect. Now I said systematists, they want to classify things into a hierarchical classification system and assign things a scientific name. This is what that system looks like. You may be, again, familiar with this from a general biology course. A series of levels where at the lowest levels have all of the features of the levels above those levels. So let me just look at an example here. We're going to look at northern cardinal. So we'll start to the family. We'll go down to the family level. So if we look at the domain Eukarya, so Eukarya are all eukaryotic organisms, every single eukaryotic organism in the world. And if you recall, again from Gen Bio, or maybe zoology or something, these are organisms with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles in their cells. So the cellular structure is the important defining factor for eukarya. Below eukarya are different kingdoms. Two that you might be familiar with are Plantae and Animalia. Plants and animals are both eukaryotes, but they have very, very different structures and embryological developments. And so we can separate them out into two groups. And so kingdom Animalia, we have organisms with a blastula during their embryonic development. These are motile organisms. They're heterotrophic, and they have aerobic respiration. All of those things together make the kingdom Animalia. Well, we could break the kingdom Animalia down into different phyla, right? And so we can keep breaking these levels down over and over and over again until we get to very specifically a species level designation. So we'll go through chordata and we'll go through aves here. So chordates have a notochord and dorsal hollow nerve cord. In their embryonic development, they'll have pharyngeal slits, and they have a post-anal tail. You are a chordate, and in fact, you are a member of the eukarya. You're a member of the animalia. You are a member of the chordata. But then when we get to chordata, we can split that up into different groups. We can split the chordata up into groups like mammalia and aves, and of course you would be in mammalia. But in this class, we're interested in the aves. And these are organisms with feathers, beak jaws, hard-shelled eggs, and hollowed bones. Things that this particular combination of things that other groups within chordata do not possess. So what you can see here is that as we go down the hierarchy, we are getting more specific. And anything below a level possesses all the qualities of the groups above that level. These groups can be called clades. Clade is sort of a generic term for any taxonomic grouping. And in fact, I prefer the term clade to using terms like domain or kingdom or phylum in general, particularly since there's some small bit of arbitrariness that comes in higher level taxonomy with exactly where some of these levels fit within this system. So it's I think better to just say clade, which just means it's an evolutionarily distinct group with a certain set of features at some part within some level within the hierarchy. That's how the hierarchical classification system works. So if I asked you a question on a test, hint, if I said, what's a bird? Well, at least as far as the extant birds are concerned, this is what a bird is. It is a member of the class Aves. It is a member of the phylum Chordata. It is a member of the kingdom Animalia. It is a member of the domain Eukarya. And it has not only these features, but also these features and these features and these features. It has all of that together is truly what makes a bird and not some other organism. And of course, we can continue down and become more and more specific with what we're talking about, all the way until we get to the genus and species levels. And since we're talking about the northern cardinal, here we have the genus for cardinal cardinalis, which has not only the northern cardinal, but two other species within that genus, the vermilion cardinal and the pyraloxia. So a genus is still not quite so specific that it gets you to uh, a single individual species, right? There's one more level to go. But like all of these species you're looking at, northern cardinal, vermilion cardinal, and the pyraloxia, are all in the genus Cardinalis. And if you see down here below, right here, C cardinalis, that means this C period is referring to the genus Cardinalis. It's Cardinalis cardinalis. This is Cardinalis phoenicius, and this is Cardinalis sinuatus. Those second parts of those names are the species names, or the specific epithets of those species. And then we can write out the whole name, Cardinalis cardinalis, and the authority, that is the individual and date of the individual that described the species and the date of that description. And that's the binomial name. So Cardinalis cardinalis is the binomial name of the northern cardinal. And the rules for the naming of animals are all outlined in the ICZN, the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. One might ask, if we have names like northern cardinal, vermilion cardinal, and pyraloxia, why do we need names like Cardinalis cardinalis, Cardinalis phoenicius, or Cardinalis sinuatus? Those are much harder names to remember. But there is a very good reason for that. And I think the common loon gives or what I would call the common loon here, gives a really good example of why scientific names are valuable and important and better than common names. So here we have what you may all know as the common loon. Beautiful, majestic bird of large lakes. Its scientific name is Gavia immer. It has a distribution that is both found in North America and in parts of Europe. If I was to pick up a phone and call, say, a friend in a European country to talk about this bird, and I speak to that person in common names, and I said, hey, I'm looking right now at a common loon, that would very possibly be confusing to them because common names are not regulated and people can use common names differently in different places. So in Europe, a typical common name for Gavia immer is the Great Northern Diver. So again, if I call my friend and I say, hey, I'm looking at a common loon right now, they might be like, well, I don't really know what that is. And that's because they don't call it a common loon. They call it something different. But if my friend is a scientist and they are well versed in scientific names, and I say, hey, I'm looking at Gavia immer, Gavia immer is specific to this one individual species, and that scientific name is universal no matter where you are on planet Earth. So scientific names give us a common frame of reference to talk about species, and that's really important because species is a fundamental unit of biology. All of these clades that we were just looking at, kingdoms and phylums and classes and whatever, all of them can be broken down into infra levels and sub levels, and essentially you can imagine breaking them into smaller and smaller chunks within a given level. So the hierarchy can get really complex, far more complex than what the simple diagram I showed would really allude to it. They can be, wildly more structured than what a simple diagram shows. In other words, there can be levels in between, say, for example, um, a family in a genus. There can be, as an example, a subfamily. At the species level, we can also have subspecies, and that might not be so intuitive because you're like, well, species is the specific organism. How can we have anything more specific than the specific organism? But we can, and so northern cardinal, one of the reasons I choose this as the example to go through is because it has a lot of subspecies. It has about something like 18 different subspecies across its range. Some of those subspecies are Cardinalis, Magnerostris, Superbus, and Canacaudus. So, Cardinalis, so if subspecies Cardinalis, its full name is Cardinalis cardinalis cardinalis. That's its trinomial name. Is sort of the most common species. It's in eastern United States and southeastern Canada, and it is often a significant point of reference when trying to describe the other subspecies. And you might be like, well, how can there even be subspecies? Well, what a subspecies really is a distinct population within a more widespread species that has some sort of diagnosable trait. It could be a very different song. It could be a relative measure of, say, like a wing to tail ratio, something like that. So, like you'd measure the lengths of the two, the tail and the wing in this case, and create a ratio, and it could be quite different in some group. It could be the physical size, in other words, the overall mass of a population. It could be bill size. That's an example within cardinals, actually. It could even be differences in the way the plumage appears. Some cardinals are far more red than other cardinals, at least when we're talking about the males. Some cardinals, the lores, that is the black mark there at the base of the bill in front of the eye, extends in a different way across the bill, or doesn't extend across the bill. And importantly, these are distinct populations within the greater range of Cardinalis cardinalis, so we can recognize these different subspecies groups. So here we have Cardinalis cardinalis. Cardinalis cardinalis is what you think of most likely when you think of a northern cardinal. But in southeast Texas through southern Louisiana, there's another species called Magnerostris. And Magnerostris has a really much heavier bill and more extensive face mask than the Cardinalis cardinalis subspecies. If you were to go into down into very far southeastern California, into Arizona and parts of southwestern New Mexico, you would potentially run into a different population of cardinals called Superbus. And Superbus, as the name superb kind of suggests, is very large. It's a big cardinal. Another interesting thing about Superbus is the lores, where the black mark is that runs across the bill. The lore, it doesn't extend across the bill. They kind of have just like a black mark that just abruptly ends, and it doesn't run over top the upper part of the bill. And if you were to go look at a subspecies, most of these subspecies we're talking about a range that sort of extends horizontally. Or longitudinally across several states. If you wanted to look at a subspecies grouping that moves from north to south, or more latitudinally, we could look at Canacaudus. Canacaudus is found in western Texas and then extends down into, western Oklahoma, and then extends down into central and western Texas. And it has shorter wings, it has a larger bill, and it is a more vibrant red. So, and that's just 4 subspecies of the approximately 18 subspecies of the northern cardinal. So that's what a subspecies is. Now, sometimes there are differences in a species that are not uh, distinct subpopulations, right? Different colors, for example, of the same species, but they're not in distinct subpopulations. They're just sort of mixed in uh, with with the 2 or 3 colors or whatever all mixed together in different places. They're not distinct subpopulations. An example of this would be something like these male Asian paradise flycatchers, where you have very distinctly here, you can see in this picture, 2 different color morphs. Um, as a result of genetic variation that is not broken into subpopulations. And these are usually called morphs, or we just call them sometimes variants. Morphs are variants of this particular species. In this case, it's gender specific, it's only in the males. So, talking a lot about species here, a really important question, and one that is not easy to answer whatsoever, is what is a species? Some of you may have encountered some definitions of species in the past. Particularly, you may have encountered the biological definition of a species, and perhaps the morphological. It is less likely that you have encountered any of these other species definitions that I have listed here. And if you have, that's great. But this is your discussion question for this week. So I'm going to post a paper by Sunichiro Naomi that covers what's called the integrated framework of species concepts. And that paper is a little difficult because it goes over a little bit of history of 2 other really important ideas on species definitions. And you may not be familiar with that history. You probably won't be familiar with that history or those authors. Nonetheless, you have to read the paper and try to get some understanding of what the author here is talking about. But the more important thing to take is the ultimate message of this paper. All right, so you'll read this paper, and from it you should be able to extract what the ultimate message of the paper is in terms of what it's saying about what a species is, even independently of really understanding de Queiros's and Maiden's writings. That's the other 2 authors that the author of this paper is going to be talking about. You should be able to get the message of the paper, even not having that background. But if you need it, you can go off and find those papers and read those papers as well. And then in your discussion question this week, you need to address your idea about what a species is and defend why you think that is what a species is. You will certainly need to have citations in this week's discussion question because you cannot defend your position without citing things. I am only asking for your position from a scientific perspective. So I would ask that whatever your personal beliefs that may lie outside of science are, if you have certain religious beliefs or whatever, like that's fine, and I fully support and appreciate that you have those, but I only want to know from a scientific perspective what you think. So please only include those ideas in your writing. And that's your discussion question. Okay, moving on. Biogeographical realms in birds. Here we have Philip Sclater. Philip Sclater was a scientist of the mid 1800s. And something that he had recognized in his research was that you can break the avifauna, that is the diversity of birds, into different regions where like certain birds tend to show up, birds that are closely related to each other tend to show up in distinct regions across the planet. And he called these zoogeographic regions. And it just so happens that the boundary of each region corresponds with a boundary to dispersion, which, if you know anything about genetics and population biology and evolution, you would know makes a really significant amount of sense. And these are the biogeographical realms as we see them today, and these are the ones that Sclater is kind of recognizing. So we have where we're at here, the Nearctic, we have the Neotropical, the Afrotropical, Palearctic, Indo-Malayan, Oceanian, Australasian, and Antarctic zoogeographic or biogeographical realms. Each of these realms has a barrier to dispersal. In other words, some sort of physical reason that is difficult for animals to move between one realm and the adjacent realm. If we look at the Americas, well, historically, it was only 3-ish million years ago that the Isthmus of Panama formed. And that is the tiny little land bridge down here that connects uh, the Americas together, North and South America. And so it wasn't until that bridge forms that you can get dispersal of a lot of different organisms between the Nearctic and Neotropical. When that happens, we have what's called the Great American Interchange, and you get a lot of organisms moving across that isthmus over, of course, a long period of time. But it's this sort of exchange of fauna between North and South America, between the Nearctic and Neotropical. But even though that bridge still exists today, the millions and millions of years of South America and North America being separated has created very, very different faunas. The birds that are here are not the same birds that are here, for example, with some exceptions. For example, we have migratory birds that actually fly all the way from South America up here to breed, and then they fly back to South America to overwinter. And so we share those birds in a manner of speaking at different times of year. And then there are birds that exist in North America that also exist down into at least northern South America. Now, birds are capable of doing something that, say, mammals aren't, and that is flight, right? And so when we talk about the significance of something like the Great American Interchange, it was less significant for the exchange of avifauna than it would have been for, say, mammalian fauna. Because birds, at least many species of birds, can disperse over water, at least for um, within a certain reasonable distance of water. And so there was only certain groups of birds that don't tend to disperse over water that really were affected by um, the formation of the isthmus 3 million years ago. Um, Obviously, if you look over here, you can, like at the Antarctic biogeographical realm, it's very clear that one of the barriers to dispersal is the actual ocean itself. And for a few of these, that is a significant barrier to dispersal is the ocean. A couple other ones that are really distinct and um, obvious if you are familiar with a little bit of geography are the barrier between the Afrotropical and Palearctic and the barrier between the Indo-Malayan and Palearctic realms. And both of these are some very distinct barriers. Here in northern Africa, you have the Sahara Desert, which is an incredibly inhospitable and large desert that a lot of animals simply cannot cross and survive. It's not that a bird can't try to fly across it, it's that it will not make it to the other side. It will die on the way. And so this is a barrier to dispersal. And then here, between the Indo-Malayan and Palearctic, we have the Himalayan mountains, which are, is a massive mountain range that is just incredibly difficult to cross. So between the ocean, the Isthmus of Panama, or, well, the Isthmus of Panama actually opened the barriers to dispersal. Before that, it was a great open ocean. Um, the Himalayan mountains, we have these different barriers that have created sort of large regions that represent different evolutions of the avifauna. And as birds have been able to and occasionally actually disperse from those areas, like as happened between the Neotropical and Neoarctic, you get an exchange of fauna in those situations. And so these are our examples of these barriers to dispersal. This one up here is showing Wallace's line. And so Wallace's line is right here between Oceanian and Indo-Malayan. And it is a deep sea trench that acts as a barrier to dispersal for a lot of different species. Okay, so let's just talk now in more general terms about avian diversity and distribution. In general, if we look at global patterns of avian diversity, there are a few rules that are generally true for diversity, at least with birds. First, that diversity increases with land area. That's, I think, fairly intuitive. Second, it's greatest near the equator. You have the most bird diversity near the equator and is lowest near the poles. So there's a latitudinal shift in the diversity of avifauna. And then finally, if you have an island in a continental landmass area of the same size, islands tend to have lower diversity than those continental landmasses do, mostly due to the continental landmass's connectivity to the rest of the continent. So these are some just general rules that you could use to sort of generally predictate, I made that word up, to generally predict where on Earth diversity will be the highest, right? It's going to be the highest on large continental land areas near the equator. Okay. No bird has a worldwide distribution. The closest would be something like the peregrine falcon, which breeds on 6 continents. Some contenders that are close to the peregrine falcon would be the barn owl and barn swallows. Barn owls are found on 5 continents, and barn swallows are found technically on 6, but they're only visitors to 2 of those continents. And from the perspective of your seabirds, things like Wilson's storm petrels, Arctic terns, and sooty shearwaters, these birds, well, as they migrate across all major oceans. So in that respect, they have pretty much so a global distribution, but they're never found far inland, right? These are ocean tethered birds, and so they don't really have a global distribution. As far as distributions go, they're actually really hard to define, though they can be relatively easy for birds with small ranges. So as an example, a bird that's only on one island is much easier to study its range than it would be to study that same species if it lived on a continent where you'd have to track that bird over much greater distances to figure out where its range ended. Another example of bird ranges that are easier to define would be a situation where a bird only uses one type of habitat. So a bird that is highly specialized, it will be easier to track its range because it's only going to be in its highly specialized habitat. So those are situations where it's not so difficult. But the fact is most birds don't meet these criteria. Most birds have very complex distributions. Many of them um, migrate, which adds another layer of complexity, meaning they have wintering, migratory, oh, breeding, and then sometimes year-round ranges all together. And you will see range maps that have different colors, kind of like you'll see this week when you look at the Anseriformes lecture, where you've got different colors that represent where the bird could be seen during migration, where it could be seen during the breeding season, where it could be during overwintering, and places where maybe the bird stays all year round. Um, and then those ranges can be massive. They can span continents. And so it's extremely difficult to pinpoint with precision what the ranges really are, especially because within a given space, within a given range, there can be holes in that range. There can be gaps in that range. And additionally, sometimes we find birds in places they really shouldn't be, and we have to take that into account when we're trying to define what a species range is. For example, birds get blown off course in storms. This happens, and we will find species that way, way, way far away from where they should actually be. A year or two ago, we had a flamingo in, I was either Pennsylvania or Ohio. There shouldn't be a flamingo in Pennsylvania or Ohio. It should have been in Florida or the Caribbean, but that's where it was, and clearly it was lost, right? And so we wouldn't go to our range maps and update the range maps to say you can find flamingos in Florida. That's not biologically realistic. The factors that limit the ranges are important in considering how to think about the ranges. And as these factors change, ranges change. So, for example, one of the most obvious factors that limit ranges is habitat availability. So, for example, if you have a species that is strongly dependent on, say, large wetlands, well, let's say grasslands. I think that's an easier one maybe to understand in this context. And let's say in the northern panhandle here, we cut down all the forest and we convert it into grassland. Well, we are going to suddenly have a lot of grassland species that we don't have in the northern panhandle of West Virginia because we've converted our habitat from deciduous forest to grassland. And birds, the grassland birds that have ranges that are um, currently not in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, have a much better chance of being seen in West Virginia, and we might have to update some range maps to account for that new difference in habitat availability. Other factors, things like food availability. The right food has to be available for the bird. The right types of nesting sites have to be available. So an example would be a number of ducks are cavity nesters. Some of them need fairly large cavities and large standing dead trees. If the large standing dead tree with a big cavity in it isn't present, the bird cannot be present in the breeding season. It's not going to be. Climate, parasites, diseases, and of course competition all also drive ultimately where birds are found. And they have synergistic effects, meaning that two or more of these factors function together to limit where a bird can be found. I should say these rules are not just for birds. Animals in general are affected by these things. So, in terms of diversity, the the amount of diversity, that is, the number of species in a given order, can be wildly different in different orders of birds. If we want to look at something highly diverse, we might look at an order like Passeriformes. Of the 10, 11,000 species of birds that we know exist today, Passeriformes make up over 6,000 of those species. So this is one order within the class Aves making up something like approximately 60% of the entirety of the class Aves. There are a lot of passeriform birds, a whole lot. On the other side of that coin are things like Mesotornithiformes. This is a very small group with just a few species of flightless birds from Madagascar. And then maybe at the most extreme end is something like Opisthocomiformes, which is represented by a single species that you see here and down there in the middle. That's called a Watson, which is a South American species with a particularly interesting biology. It's got the digestive system that is very similar to that of a cow. It's got a ruminant-style digestive system and actually essentially has a fermentation chamber in its gut. And we'll take a look at that as we get into the anatomy and physiology 2-week section coming up here in a few weeks. So the point here is that when you look at these different orders, it's not like every order has about the same number of species. It's not. The number of species within an order is reflective of evolution and how many species within that particular grouping have evolved to exist. And it turns out Passeriformes, these little perching songbirds, have incredible diversity and because they've been incredibly successful. And so they're very diverse. Sometimes modern group diversity and doesn't really represent the true diversity of that species over larger time spans, nor does it necessarily represent the true range of that species over large time spans. A really good example of this are mouse birds in the order Coleoformes. So Coleoformes, mouse birds, right now there are 5 species, I believe 5 species, known from Africa. If you were to look at the fossil record in North America and Europe, you will see that historically mouse birds were present in North America and in Europe. Those lineages in North America and Europe went extinct. So they're not represented today. And so the diversity is lower now, and it's the range of this entire order, its global distribution is much, much more narrow. Ultimately, these variations in avian diversity are driven by certain key innovations. And those key innovations are things like flight, singing, mate attraction in terms of maybe certain behaviors or plumage characteristics, territorial behaviors, sexual dimorphism, and dispersal ability. These are some of the most important things that have driven the diversification of these different avian groups to be what they are. So the end of this chapter goes into the origins of birds and talks a bit about dinosaurs and a bit about evolution and how we get to post-Mesozoic modern birds. I am going to cover that at the beginning of the next module because the next module, well, the next book chapter, is on avian evolution. I think the chapter is called How Birds Evolve. And the narrative of that chapter, to me, makes more sense to start with bird origins and just work up into that than it does to talk about bird origins now and talk about that separately. So we will talk about bird origins during Module 3 and expand into how birds evolve from there. Again, of course, if you have any questions, if, say, it's been 6 years since you had Gen Bio and you don't really understand the Linnaean taxonomy that well, there are a lot of resources online for that, but always you can contact me and ask me any questions that you have about this stuff. So please feel free to do that if you have questions. Have a good day.